Well, percentage, it's a good question. Even China itself also is disappointed itself, it's not happy. But the main question for China now, China is has been caught whether China should go with the Western way or to remain its own way, its own way. Well, but the latest development show, China probably will follow the West way. For example, lately, China, worked with the United States in the case of North Korea, so quite clear. And China, a lot of people in China are not happy. China is growing, at least economically, but China looks like China doesn't have many good friends. So many people, of course, are saying, if we go West way, at least we can make at least some friend, right? Some friend. We don't need. We have a huge market. We have a huge economic advantage. While we cannot make some friend, so it's really a matter of choice. But so far, I would say China still, is struggling, which way to go. But in terms of maritime and the strategy, China was not a great power. Maritime power. China doesn't have experience in dealing with that. China has to learn. But don't have a very high expectation about China. Even you look back to the United States, it took the United States so many decades to learn how to behave like a great power. It took even longer time for the British to learn how to behave. China actually is learning, I would say. So China is not happy about itself, so it has to learn. Then your question about China whether China will use agents like Pakistan to defend itself, I would say no. China is very suspicious. China actually, I look at read some papers about China, talk about the U.S. because the United States has a lot of alliances. Well, it has good advantage, also bad side. For example, U.S.-Japan alliance. When Japan does something silly or Japan does something rational, U.S. bear a sort of responsibility. Well, China's only alliance so-called North Korea. China has been headache for China. So China tend to be still to remain independent. China doesn't want to have a very close alliance. Whatever this alliance does something, China has to bear responsibility. So I don't say China will treat Pakistan as a very close alliance against a third party. They will not. But they're friends, just friends. They will not have like a U.S.-Japan type of alliance. It's quite unlikely. It's not in Chinese thinking, at least at this moment.
Oh, yeah. Well, the neighborhood, I think one of the successes of this current Indian government has been to build better relationships in the neighborhood, including with Pakistan, although there's always a certain amount of turbulence. So to that extent, and that's been driven partly by India wanting to step outside and play a bigger role on the theory that if you don't pacify in the best sense your neighborhood, you can't step out strategically. So I think your point's well taken. That's a generally good idea. Unfortunately, of course, the neighborhood, there are domestic shifts can take place very quickly. This is the only region in Asia where all the countries are democratically elected today. But there's great volatility internally, and those democracies could switch back to military dictatorship very quickly. So I think it's not assured that India's near neighborhood, South Asia, will remain that calm. And of course the Chinese, as Raj pointed out, are increasingly involved. But I think India has been quite astute there, even there, because if you look at, ASEAN again is a bit of a model. It invited powers into its region and participated in its institutions. And gradually India has come around to the same view about South Asia. So under some pressure, as Raj shows in the book, it acquiesced in the Chinese becoming an observer member of SAARC. And it's increasingly said that the Chinese have a role in South Asia. And on Sri Lanka, coming back to it, India has turned a Nelsonian eye to both Pakistani and Chinese aid to the Sri Lankan government during the last days of the civil war. So India has played a far more sophisticated game now in the neighborhood. And I think that does account for its ability to kind of look further abroad. So I can just leave it there. I think, you know, the idea that, as I said, I mean, the Pakistan factor could be a real factor in India's maritime ambitions in this so-called Indo-Pacific. And I think that's one part that doesn't come across very well in the book. I mean, Raj doesn't vent it too much, but it's probably worth thinking about what the Pakistanis could do. Myself, I'm a bit skeptical on how much the Chinese would actively use the Pakistanis. I mean, they have their own worries about Pakistan. Pakistani extremism, instability, the role of the Pakistani military, the future of Afghanistan and the Pakistani role there. And it's quite striking that the Chinese have been, you know, quite measured and cautious about taking up the Pakistani offer on Gwadar. So it's still an open question whether China would really take advantage of that, even though the incentives might be quite strong. So, I mean, I'll just leave it there. I mean, I think Prasenji's broad point is an interesting one. It's also an interesting one for India, which is what's the diversity of views and what coherence is there on these issues.
I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, thanks. I think on Pakistan, I mean, clearly, on the maritime side, Pakistan is not central. So that's the reason why we neglect Pakistan. That doesn't mean Pakistan is not part of India's overall security consciousness. And many Indians, I think, now believe that, look, Pakistan's power is actually a projection of Chinese power. So we're not really, in that sense, it's a dependent variable. Dependent variable doesn't mean new things are not going to happen. That there's speculation already that if India is going to deploy nuclear weapons on submarines, Chinese might give a nuclear submarine to Pakistan, but that fits in quite consistently with their past behavior. There's a lot of debate on Gwadar. Our Singaporean friends were there, they've come out, you know, the Chinese are going to go in. The Pakistanis have openly talked about giving a base to the Chinese. So that's about the Chinese power, emerging power in the Indian Ocean. And all this talk about a string of pearls, people talk about Gwadar. But Karachi, there's already a substantive Chinese presence. Chinese have a major engineering works. They've got the facility to repair Chinese ships that are beginning to operate. And if you look at the port calls by the Chinese ships operating in the Gulf of Aden, all of them are consistently called on the Karachi port. So there is already a forward presence in that sense. So Pakistan is as a sword arm of the Chinese is very interesting. But on its own, I think people talked about the asymmetry. In 10 years down the road, 15 years down the road, India is going to be 16 times larger than the Pakistan economy. So it's a problem that India will have to deal with. But it's not the paradigm that a whole generation of 3 generations of academics have called India, Pakistan, India, Pakistan, India, Pakistan. That is breaking down. So in a sense, Pakistan will become a part of an India-China problem rather than a separate, unique Pakistan problem. Second, I think on Panikkar, I mean, I'm a Panikkar fan, so I'm not going to accept countries. And I don't think consistency is a great virtue. Those of us who spend 40 years in academia, you know, you can't keep your own arguments on a consistent basis. And those who served in public life, those who are part of a diplomat, a professional, a divan, a bureaucrat, you're not going to expect them to maintain consistency. I mean, I don't really care whether they're consistent. The fact is, someone puts across an interesting idea. That idea has a life of its own. It doesn't matter whether he himself might contradict it later, that if Panikkar says, look, India has a potential to become a seapower, and people pick it up 40 years down the road, that is still Panikkar's idea. I mean, I think because someone who's articulated it first. So to that extent, it has value. I take the great George Kennan for example, the man who articulated the long telegram, Mr. X, containment. He cribbed like hell 40 years down the road. Look, this is not what I meant. Who cares? That idea has acquired a life of its own and acquired a bureaucratic dynamism in Washington. That doesn't originally care. We're not going to, it's not a mantra that we're going to stick to Kennan. Because Kennan has an idea, that idea acquires a life, people distort it, misuse it, manipulate it for different reasons. But as an idea, it will always be Kennan. When you talk about containment, it will always be Kennan. So when you talk about India and sea power, you're always going to go back to Panikkar as someone who saw the potential, saw it largely an extension, the continuation of the Raj, under a new framework, without being colonial, that in a new framework where India would do what Raj did. But many things changed. Partition changed. Land-based threats, China as a new land neighbor changed it. So I think there are circumstances that change it, but as India today globalizes, the day India turned towards globalization, the Navy came into its own. So I think the link between naval power and globalization is a direct one, and the day India opens up, Navy becomes more important, and that's the reason why it continues to be important. Domestic politics, as Prasenjit said, look, I mean, it just, as you rightly pointed out, what happened in the earlier Chinese period, there is going to be bureaucratic contestation. A lot of people sitting in the army says, look, why the hell are you doing with the Navy all this stuff? All comes skepticism. If an army chief, I would use that every one of them against the Navy chief. Why Navy is overplaying its hand, it should not have all this stuff. But I think it's overall the political judgment that comes in. That my sense is, it is a section of the dominant realists today in Delhi think, look, land is a stalemate, you've got to keep doing with the Chinese and the Pakistanis what you have to. India's historic opportunity, strategic sense, is in the seas. Where the asymmetry is not a comprehensive one. China has constrained borders in a naval sense. There's a string of islands facing it, the Americans sit on top of it. India has open seas, and that India for the chance, it's by going naval that India for the first time has an opportunity to play the game in a different way than it has in the last 60 years. So I think that is a new argument in Delhi. It might still lose that argument. Just as those in the 18th Party Congress who are talking about maritime rights, China must emerge as a maritime power, might still lose that argument if domestic politics changes too fast. So, but it's an open-ended thing. But the fact is, there is a new element to it, which did not exist before, and that new element in both the capitals is the maritime issue, and I think that's what makes it interesting. The last couple of points on interdependence and power. Should interdependence, that is the size of your interdependence, as you rise to be a major economic power, does it automatically produce naval power? And I think that's rightly been questioned by everyone here. But my sense is that if India and China are not going to be Japan, look, the Americans will take care of the collective goods, the Americans will take care of energy security in the Gulf. But China and India are not going to accept the proposition, which many of my American friends say, look, why don't you let the market play this? You know, why are you building a navy? But don't be stupid. Let the market forces decide the oil prices. Now, if market forces for everything, the US would not have a special relationship with the House of South. Why don't you let the market prices decide? All these days, Anglo-Americans dominated the market. But yet, they built a relationship with the Saudis, which is fundamentally a special relationship, an alliance relationship, a relationship based on power projection. So it is not that, this depends on the circumstance. I think China and India are different from Japan. China and India are different from others, but they're similar to the US or Britain in the past, saying, look, I'm not going to let my 20,000 workers sitting in Libya be rescued by NATO forces. Historically, for the first time, Chinese ships showed up in the Mediterranean in 2011, rescuing 30,000 Chinese workers from Libya. Indian Navy showed up, withdrawing about 18,000 Indians and South Asians from Libya. This is a new thing. Chinese and Indians are doing new things. Does it tell you something about the likely direction they're going in? That the interdependence has produced the need or a bureaucratic justification for greater naval power? Yes, that's a new fact. I think that's something we got to deal with. And lastly, about Mandela, look, I think it's a conventional wisdom in IR that, look, if you don't stabilize your neighborhood, your ability to project power is going to be, it's going to be difficult. To the extent that Chinese have been relatively successful, the charm offensive, soft power, etc., the last many years, but today, the Chinese are having problem with most of their neighbors. In India, similarly, partition-induced problems for India within its neighborhood are deep with Pakistan and Bangladesh. Some of them are being addressed today. That problem exists. That doesn't mean China and India are going to be constrained by the neighbors either. There will be a problem with a chain and a ball. But as they grow, their economies are transforming. They would simultaneously seek a global role. It will be limited, it will be constrained. That doesn't mean they won't try. China and India is not going to not build a navy just because it has a Pakistan problem or it has a problem with Bangladesh. So I think there's certain other imperatives come into play, but they'll have to be balanced against the logic. And what it does is it opens up the other powers to play in your backyard. Chinese have shown it so well, playing in India's backyard. India is doing a little bit, trying to do something with Vietnam, Japan, as Kanti pointed out, but it is still in a preliminary play at this point of time. So therefore, the vulnerability on their frontiers opens them to to play by other powers. And I think that's a classical geopolitical thing. But in the longer term, I think what China and India are doing is, the maritime thing is a new element in the strategic calculus. And how that plays out, I think is open-ended, but I think it's worth studying. And for Southeast Asia, which is in between, is going to face many of the effects. And we're also in a position to shape what China and India do in the coming years.
Thank you, Raja Mohan. I have to bring this session